Hello everyone, welcome to the 12th lecture of Spatial Statistics and Spatial Econometrics. Today we are going to sort of steer in a direction which will provide a more definitive measure of spatial dependence. We will obviously mobilize the concept of spatial stationarity that we covered in the previous lecture. If you think about it, we have covered quite a bit of ground till now, right? So if we sort of before moving forward to a quite substantially different direction, let's do a short recap in order to appreciate the ground that we have covered till now and how sort of it binds together and provides a pathway for the next chapter in this series of lectures. So if we were to do a short sort of recap, short and quick recap, the first, we started this course with an introduction to modern data sets, modern spatial data sets, and their applications, right? So we sort of, looked at who cares about spatial analysis, who uses which sector in the industry has an extensive use of these of this tool set, and where does it fit in academic research, and so on and so forth. We also saw that now we have quite many freely available, ready to use spatially delineated data sets, right? After that, we developed what we called as a general spatial model. A general spatial model basically provided us with mathematical devices in order to summarize the data that we see pictorially or visually, right? So we are very used to looking at spatial data as an image, right? As a picture that you can click on the camera of your phone, or very sophisticated cameras that may be handheld, could be mounted on a drone, or even attached to a satellite as a sensor, right? All of these data sets can be sort of summarized using a general mathematical model, right? And when we did that, we looked at things like distance metrics, right? Different distance metrics that help us summarize the spatial patterns in these data sets. And we also looked at what we called as the data structures, right? So the data sets come in various structures, and we also have we also summarize them, some of them as vector data, raster data. Within those there are several other forms. We have these definitions called geostatistical data, lattice data, right? So and so on. So vector and raster are formats to store data, whereas geostatistical or lattice data or point data, polygon data, so on and so forth are ways to manipulate or analyze those data. So the structures have different forms and meanings and uses, right? After that, we changed our gears a little bit. We looked at this concept of spatial entropy, right? We took entropy as a measure of variation in space, right? General variation in space, and then we use this pattern to provide a model for a monocentric city. All right. And after we covered a spatial entropy, that is a measure of variation over space, we move one step further and we studied something like spatial autocorrelation. Okay, so from a general measure of variation in space, we went on to talking about a measure of dependence in space, right? And we looked at spatial autocorrelation and its consequences for statistical inference. We did this in one-dimensional sequence of data. We also did this for two-dimensional sequence of data. Then we went on to, also study, I'm just going to say 4 continued. We also looked at what we call as Monte Carlo simulations, right? Which we said that, look, I mean, you have all these mathematical analytical results, which can be quite complex at times. They involve, applying algebra, calculus, and various other concepts. A numerical substitute or an alternative for these analytical results that we have, that we study in statistics are simulations, right? And specifically Monte Carlo simulations. After that, we covered what is called as the exploratory spatial data analysis, right? We said that whenever we get a data set, our first job is to summarize that data set. What if we get a data set which is spatially delineated? So we covered methods and tools that are specifically designed for such data sets. And just in the previous, a couple of lectures, we have looked at the concept of spatial stationarity. Okay, spatial stationarity is crucial. It's a decision. It is not a hypothesis. It is a crucial decision. It validates any statistic in space, right? Even mean, median, outliers, whatever we do, we must work in a stationary domain to conduct any kind of spatial analysis. Okay, so now that we have come to a point that we can indeed understand a domain that is stationary and we can conduct a spatial analysis, we will now go on to, formally introduce the idea of spatial contiguity or spatial continuity and provide a measure for this or alternative measures for spatial contiguity over stationary domains. So going forward, whenever we define these concepts, including the means and variances and measures of summary statistic for spatial contiguity or spatial autocorrelation, we are going to be assuming that we are working with a stationary domain. And wherever we have, a discussion is due in order to sort of make sure that we are indeed working with a stationary domain, we will, provide that discussion. Okay, so let's move let's sort of, move forward. So spatial contiguity is, could also be called as spatial continuity. Ultimately, we are thinking about spatial dependence. Okay, we are thinking formally about spatial dependence. So let's start with the figure in front, and let's talk about the panel on the right. So let's look at the right panel first. So the right panel provides me data which are visually delineated with 5 different colors. Okay, these colors are green, gray, orange, black, and blue. Say these colors represent different levels of intensities at which the data are recorded. Often these intensities are also called as digital numbers, right? So we assign a number, a unique number to each color so that each color sort of is providing a categorical level at which the data are observed. Quite clearly on the right hand side, what is happening is that you have data distributed in columns where the data moves first at level 1, then level 2, and level 3, and then level 4, it's going to be, and then level 5. All right. Now, what the utility of having data distributed over space on the right hand side the way it is that there is some kind of a spatial structure going on. And the same spatial structure is that when we begin from left to right, we begin from left and go on to the right direction, what happens is that the data remain at the same intensity for a certain distance before it crosses onto a boundary, after which it sort of changes its intensity to something else. Okay, that means that there is spatial dependence going on in left to right, such that it sort of changes drastically discretely after a boundary, whereas from top to bottom, if I start at any given value and I straight go south, I'm going to be on the exact same value. This tells me that if I have an observation at any point on level 1, and I want to predict an unknown value, south of the observed value, right at its south, I can actually accurately predict it to be belonging to category 1 or level 1, right? So spatial dependence, as categorized in the figure on the right hand side, the right panel, right, is providing me an opportunity to utilize the fact that the data are spatially dependent in a given structure to then predict unknown values from observed or sampled values, right? We talked about the fact that we can't actually realistically sample every location in space, right? It is very expensive, right? And often not even possible, because all areas in space on the land, for example, are not accessible, right? So prediction is key, right? And if you have some spatial structure, some spatial dependent structure, right, which provides a kind of a correlation structure over space, right, a definitive correlation structure, then we are looking at a scenario where we can use this information in order to predict values of a random variable at unknown locations, right? So if coal were to exist as is the right panel, right, it makes my life very, very easy, right? I can make samples, in a direction, right, from left to right, and I can find these boundary points, and once I find these boundary points, I'm kind of done, right? Once I have my boundary points figured out over space, I don't really need to sample anything else in these columns, all right? Right? Because these columns are perfectly correlated from north to south. So all I need is an estimate of where the boundary points are, right? If life were so convenient in the real world, prediction would become very, very accurate and very, very easy, right? But that's not going to be the case. That's not to be the case so easy. It doesn't appear to be so easy in the real world. If you look at the left panel, that's a case where the data seem to be distributed, or the categories or levels seem to be distributed more randomly in space, right? That is to say that if I were to take samples at some locations in space and use those to then, try and predict unknown values, it's going to be not so easy, right? So some of the values are missing, some of the values are known, right? So the circles are missing data, and my objective as an analyst is to predict these data, and crosses are where I have my sample observations. So I can merely use the data that are observed at these, these locations where I'm sampling them, and I want to predict, what's happening at unknown locations, right? It is quite possible that some of the locations might not have any known samples. And then if there are so many boundaries to be predicted in so many different directions, it's going to make my life very, very hard to figure out, what's the structure, spatial dependent structure, do we have any? Of course, there is a lot of very strong spatial, dependence within each block or each polygon, so to say. But in order to predict where the boundaries of these blocks will sort of, end, or we are going into a different regime, I'm going to have to do more intense, more costly sampling. And I really don't know, if this structure on the left panel exists beneath the ground, I really don't know how many samples to take where. It's a very difficult abstract problem. So the panel on the left represents a scenario where there is no or little spatial contiguity or spatial continuity, right? That is, there is little or no, very less correlation in data on the left hand side, across samples in space. And you're looking at somehow random values being observed, at different locations in space, right? If I were to go in and sample locations sparsely, I will probably merely get data, in all different, regimes. They're going to be very different values. I'm going to be confused when I look at them. I'm not going to be able to find a structure. And, honestly, it's going to be very, very hard to predict what the unknown values are with a sparse sampling exercise. Okay? Right? Everything that is non-sampled is actually unknown, right? So the circles are everywhere. We do not have the crosses. So you can imagine the kind of intense exercise it would be to conduct spatial prediction when the, real world natural structure is given as a left-hand panel versus the right-hand panel, right? And it's hard to learn from sample observation. So spatial dependence, spatial contiguity, although when we look at it, as a concept to learn separately, as something to estimate, it seems like, it is more work. But on the other hand, it provides us a utility on the side of prediction. That is, if I know a few values, at the boundary, I can know everything else without doing much, right? So some pain in estimating, spatial dependent structures, but a lot of value in terms of spatial prediction. Okay, let's sort of provide a definition to spatial contiguity. It is a summary of spatial pattern as a univariate statistic, just like mean, variance, but beyond mean and variance. It is typically a measure of correlation of values over space, values being observations, right? And I say values, I basically mean data values, right? So observations in space, and it's a measure of how similar or homogeneous these values are over space. Spatial contiguity provides information that may be useful for prediction in space, right? So it is the sort of the utility of going through this process of estimating spatial dependence, of learning about spatial dependence in data. Okay, all right, let's move forward. Let's look at this much more sort of a nicer example by Professor Michael Perch. Now on the left hand side, you see a really random process, right? I mean, you have these little cells over which the data is distributed, and if you're standing on any cell, it's really hard to predict what's going on in its neighborhood, because the neighborhood is so heterogeneous. It is so different no matter where you stand on this left panel, right? So you have a very high spatial heterogeneity going on, even local spatial heterogeneity going on the left panel. On the right panel, however, we see a very non-random spatial process, right? On the right panel, what happens is, if I stand at any location, I have some level of confidence that around me things are going to look very similar. Okay, of course there are complications because there are these boundaries over which the processes change. But you can imagine that, a not so intense sampling exercise can provide us where the boundaries are. And once we know the boundaries, we will know, what to expect of the values in the neighborhood, right? So again, an example where the left panel provides us no spatial dependence. So, if you know spatial statistics, probably you don't really, get too further in the sense of estimating the structure of spatial dependence. But then you also don't have any information for prediction. On the right hand side, you have a situation which is much closer to spatial processes, right? If you think about long-term geological processes, the way land structures, elevations, river structures, river pathways come about, those are glacial processes, right? So they have been happening over time. They are very slow, and they are also highly spatially contiguous. You don't have plains and mountains moving, mountainous regions, fluctuating over space. You have a mountainous belt, and then you have a large plain structure, just like if you think about the geography of India, right? So learning about spatial statistics indeed sort of provides us to, an opportunity to model such structures, but then also to conduct prediction, which has a lot of economic and social value, okay? Now here, it's an example where we can consider a decision to harvest groundwater from an aquifer having different permeability measures, right? So an aquifer is something that we saw last time. It's a rock structure beneath the ground, and it could be permeable or porous, or non-permeable or non-porous, right? The colors on the right hand side, you can think of them as providing a gradient from permeability to non-permeability, right? So reds could be highly non-porous rocks, just like, tubs where water doesn't move around laterally. And blues, moving from red to yellows to greens to blues, we are moving towards more porous structures. Now, if we want to understand where should we draw groundwater from, or where the depletion could be a lot bigger problem, well, such an understanding of the structure beneath the surface will be very, very useful. And in the sense that, if I draw water from, let's say, location where I have sort of marked on your screen, there will be a larger spillover on these, porous structures, except for this little red rock in the middle, if I were to draw a lot of water from this, southwest well. If I draw water from this central well, it's going to cause a lot of spillover in its, northwest and western direction, and very little in this non-porous direction, which is the southeast direction, right? So the spillovers in groundwater levels, that is depletion or decline, will probably happen more and more in the locality in directions that are not the northeastern direction, where you have these high non-porous rocks, right? So they're not going to allow water to flow in if you start drawing a lot of water from this central well, okay? So such economic decisions are possible if we have spatial dependence in space, or spatial contiguity in space. What I present here is another very nice, I think a very nice, a way to sort of understand if you see data, if you have a univariate data set where you have porosity measures and depth from ground, or from any location depth going in any direction over space, then if you plot these data and they look highly irregular, right? They look highly irregular, then that's a signal of low spatial correlation in the data. Low spatial correlation means less spatial contiguity. That's more like left panels, the two figures that we have seen, and that means lesser information for prediction. Which is also clear, the fact that if you were to sort of observe, let's say, these three observations that I've marked with a cross going down, it's going to be very hard to predict what's coming next, right? Versus if you were doing it, for example, in case of a very high spatial correlation structure, which is the figure in the in the second quadrant, right, which is the on the southeast of this image, then predicting will be easier if you had unknown samples relative to the figure on the northwest of this image. Okay. All right. So next step, now that we understand spatial contiguity, its utilities and so on and so forth, the next step is measuring spatial contiguity. And the good news is we have already seen the devices, most of the devices that are involved in measuring spatial contiguity. First is the variogram. Now when we studied intrinsic stationarity, we actually specified a variogram in the definition of intrinsic stationarity. So the variogram is written as 2 gamma S1 minus S2, S1 and S2 are vectors, and S1 minus S2 means the distance between these vectors, so distance metric and location. And they are equal to variance of the first difference between values observed at this distance, right? We also looked at the covariogram last time, which is nothing but covariance of the values observed at any two locations in space. We also have a correlogram, which is nothing but a correlation analog with univariate statistic. When we move from covariance to correlation, we can imagine moving from a covariogram to a correlogram, right? So we will see, we will go over these devices or these measures one by one, but I have some notes for you on the right hand side of the screen, which I would like to go over before we go there. So all these measures are defined over a domain of analysis, right? So as analysts, we choose this domain. We have talked about this quite a bit in this lecture series, right? So this D, it must be a stationary domain, right, for any and all of these statistics to be valid. If we are working with a non-stationary domain D, then we cannot define a variogram, right? So the variogram remains undefined. C0 is the variance of random variables at a given location. So C0 is just covariance of ZS1 and ZS2, where S1 is exactly equal to S2. If S1 and S2 are exactly equal, their distance between them will become 0, and this covariance will just be the variance, right? This is something we are already aware of. The quantity gamma is called as the semi-variogram. Variogram is a measure of dissimilarity over distance. Well, we will look at it more carefully in a couple of minutes. And the covariogram is a measure of similarity over distance. So what I am declaring right away is that variogram and covariogram are directly inversely related. Okay, this is also something that we have seen earlier, but now going forward, we will now develop these things more formally and look at their statistical properties. Okay. Now, one thing that we see here is a lag vector H. Now, H is a vector, as seen during discussions of stationarity again, is the L2 norm or the distance metric between two location vectors S1 and S2, right? H always will contain two pieces of information. One is the direction, right? Where is when we look at a pair of observations, what direction are we moving when you're moving from S1 to S2 or S2 to S1, vice versa, right? And the other is obviously the distance, right? And here what I've done is I've simply sort of taken the definitions of variogram, covariogram, and correlogram, and I have given you the definitions in terms of H rather than S1 minus S2 in the vector form. Okay, so going forward, we are going to now we will discuss the variogram in detail.